That was awesome.
Thanks, Jenny.
I loved it.
Thanks.
I love that you also highlighted a bunch of the sort of more personal stories.
Yeah.
Right? What I love about this book, I'm just going to tell you, I love this book. I think every single person needs to buy it and read it and share it and gift it because I'll be honest, I needed to read it. I really did because it was such a great combination of your personal experiences but woven into exactly what is happening in our country right now and in a way that you bring in the facts but it's not too heavy with the facts and it's just nice, it's just right, you know what I'm saying? I'll tell you
It's a good beach read, guys.
you know
That's what she's trying to say.
basically no, it's very readable because
Yeah.
I'll tell you this. Other than the fact that I needed to read it for tonight because I did want to because I want to like engage on the topics that you're talking about after 2016, this is, I don't know, I mean, you all are book people, right? Total book people. Every problem I have in my life, I have like 5 books that I bought for it, right? You're like, oh God, what do I do? And you're like, maybe there's a book, you know? And what I did was after the 2016 election, I was like, what do I need to do? And I remember like looking at all the books. You know, I bought the Hillary book, the one that was like talking about what happened with the campaign and blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
I did not touch that thing. I'm like, wait, we just lived it. I don't want to relive this bullshit with all the technicalities involved. No, this is not enjoyable. I am hurting, you know. I bought myself a $65 life-size teddy bear. That's literally what I did after the elections, you know. And so I think it's in that context for me as someone who loves books and who has like a bunch of books that I've started and maybe haven't finished that made this book and this read especially helpful, I think, for me right now. You know, and I think we were talking earlier, I just wanted to start by talking about sort of how this book is helping me. Because why not? Personal is political. Anyway, well, I'm not making fun of that. I mean it. But you know, I'm a stand-up comedian. I was formerly in the labor movement, and I left because I burnt out, and you know, the succubus that is politics drained me of my 20-something energy, and I decided I would answer my calling to be more creative, and that turned into being a writer and a stand-up comedian. And I also make digital video, so whatever, you could look it up. There's a place in me that wanted to create, that wanted to make something, that just couldn't do it, you know, because I was still reeling from understanding what was happening around us and what role we needed to play. And I think so 2018 happened, and I was like, you know what? Trump took enough of my joy. I'm just gonna come out, gangbusters, fuck it, I'm just gonna make videos. So I did. But you know, there is still a part of me that still wonders, what role do I need to play as a comedian or an artist, and just as a person, right? We all marched, that's great, right? But I think I wonder what will it really take for us to shift things. And what I appreciate about your book is that it's so readable, which is not to say it's not dense with content. It's so readable because it helped me to give me a little bit of that distance and perspective that I think I needed to weave all of these things together, which is what you really do. I love that you bring together, you know, I think if I could say what I think the main thesis is,
Sure.
right? So the idea is the marginalized majority. We are in the majority and we need to claim that, right? That we are not, we shouldn't be playing defense by thinking that it is still this narrative of whatever, the white working class or whatever is the dominant narrative, that in fact, you know, America's values and needs, we hold them in us as the marginalized majority. And I think that's a very powerful concept. And I think, you know, amongst my friends and colleagues, we would talk about that. But I love that you really crystallize that in this book, and you kind of break down why that is true, and therefore what we need to do. And so what I really appreciated was being reminded as someone who used to be a professional activist, you know, and you could argue maybe I am, but I don't even, you know, I'm a comedian. But you know, when I used to be a professional activist, that's all we talked about. You know, organizing is a methodology, you know, in labor organizing or community organizing, right? It's some of you who are familiar. It is like a science. And I love that you reminded me that, in fact, we need to undo the narratives that we have been told around what it takes to make change.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that a lot of the narratives that we've been fed immediately after the election are terrifying, right? It's like America's never been more divided. We're screwed. And I think you were saying like, this is the book that you needed. I feel like I wrote the book that I also needed. I mean, like the book is sort of my journey through being terrified. But what I was more terrified of was, again, seeing these these are common narratives that are perpetuated all the time in moments of political crisis. And my own journey as a progressive journalist, I kind of saw some of this happening during the 8 years of Bush 2. And so when Trump came around, I was like, I don't want us to, because what happened then is I saw a lot of friends and colleagues really kind of pushed back on their heels and feeling defensive and like, well, we just got to wait this thing out. And what happened in the wake of the election is that I was terrified, obviously, for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that scared me more than what Trump was going to do and what he was doing was the notion that the people who need to stand up and fight the most were already kind of counting themselves out and wanting to bury their heads in the sand. And so that's what kind of got me going down this path, because in reality, like when I started doing the research, this notion that we're more divided than ever before, again, predicated on it's just totally false, right? Like if you look at, obviously there's just the fact of Hillary Clinton got a lot more votes, but that aside, when you look at the core issues that the majority of Americans are concerned about, whether it's access to education, healthcare, really common basic things, vast majority of Americans want these things.
Yeah.
So in reality, I was like, yeah, we've never been more divided, but the divide is not between each other as the most notable problematic divide. The divide is between what the majority of Americans want and what the handful of extremists who have power right now are offering.
In political leadership.
Yeah. And it's like, when you look at it that way, I was like, oh, this is a completely different reality. This is a reality in which if we recognize that and push forward, it's a matter of time before that handful of extremists, it's going to take work, right? Yeah. But it's much less terrifying and disempowering as kind of the narratives we were constantly being fed. Yeah. One of which was also that protest is pointless.
Yeah, and I love that too, is that you brought in some examples of social movements, right? Like the civil rights movement and other things that remind us that in fact it was those things that made change happen. Mm-hmm. Like, I love the example of Rosa Parks. I mean, I feel like if you talk, in sort of how do people get activated? Rosa Parks is a great example of that that you mentioned, which is people just thought she was some old lady who just got tired when she was in her 40s. Number one, for some reason, people want to make
so weird
black women tired and old.
Well, they just can't tell how old black people are. So like, she's, I don't know, 15,
she could be 20, she could
80?
be 80. Who knows? Yeah. So she was in her 40s. She was long trained.
Yeah, member of the NAACP.
Yeah, with nonviolent organizing, and she was chosen, in fact, because she knew that she, as a person and symbolically, would be a good, kind of linchpin for what was supposed to happen, which is say, this is not right. How are you going to let a nice lady not sit in the front?
Yeah, totally. And the way we get it, the way we receive that narrative generally in textbooks is like, Rosa Parks, she was this grandmotherly figure and like she was tired, and then all of a sudden everyone was like, oh wait, we should probably let everyone ride the buses no matter what. Yeah, it kind of, because we collapse it and make it a two-dimensional story, erasing the fact that this was the kind of activism that was being engaged in by a variety of Americans. There were so many Americans and black Americans who did the same thing as Rosa Parks and were arrested, and that never made headlines. Yeah. But that doesn't mean, and this is what I unpack in the book too, it doesn't mean that those weren't successful, quote unquote, or that they were failures, right? Yeah. It's just that the way that we tend to talk about protest is that if it doesn't lead immediately to some kind of change, then we're like, well, that was a waste of time,
Totally.
And it's just kind of this deep-seated knee-jerk reaction we have towards protest. But again, like the fact that we all think of like civil rights movement, that needed to happen. It was inevitable, an important, move towards real equality. But at the time, the people who were protesting, the people who were freedom riders, the people doing the lunch counter sit-ins, they were not that popular. No. They did not have majority support in America. And we see the same kind of thing today, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter. The percentages are a little higher in terms of support, but it's still not a majority in terms of people who are supporting these explicit protest movements. So my hope is that learning this kind of history, resurfacing these kinds of narratives and understanding that we're not kind of getting the full picture will hopefully enable us to be like, hey, maybe we can cut that window of time between like not understanding how important this is and being like, yeah, that's really important. We can like shrink it to like very little time. Yeah.
No, I mean, I feel like we see that today, right? That, here in Los Angeles especially, whenever there's a protest that blocks a freeway, oh, God forbid, freeway exit got blocked. You hear people commenting online. Your friends are like, I mean, I'm totally supportive, but like, not during rush hour. That's like usually what you hear. And it's like, well, no, duh, that's also the point, right? But this idea that, oh, it's just so inconvenient protest, but duh, like it's like it baked into what it is, and that we have this like, it's like this idea that we're like all of a sudden everyone's like, oh yeah, we agree the civil rights movement's good, right? Yeah. But back then they were like, no, this was annoying. Who is this lady keeping my bus
Why are you
from
so
being on
impatient?
time? Why are you so impatient? But I feel like the analogy is like, like in high school, just to be petty, you're like, there's this one guy that like you thought no one liked, and then like all of a sudden the popular girl decided to take him out to homecoming, and then you're like, oh my God, he's been cute the whole time. That's how it feels. Anyway, no.
Yeah.
We'll try that analogy another time. We'll find another analogy.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was useful for me when I was researching this book and also just like thinking about protests more generally is there are kind of two general types of protest or action, and one is expressive and one is instrumental. So instrumental is usually, like, we're protesting or doing this action because we want you to overturn this law or something very specific, right? But then expressive encompasses something more broad. That can be an action that helps solidify, like the Women's March is a great example of an expressive action where, there was obviously a variety of demands. There wasn't one clear call for something specific, but it was an unprecedented number of people in the streets around the world who were looking at each other and finding solace and solidarity. And I think the problem is that especially in this country, there's a lot of, we're so fixated on the instrumental actions that we lose sight of the fact that expressive actions, and often the two go in tandem, but anything that looks more like an expressive action, we're like, what a waste of time. And part of this, and I get into this in the book as well, is the way that a lot of news outlets cover protest erases the importance of those expressive actions. So, in the book, I recount the many headlines that literally before, during, and after the Women's March were like, why the Women's March has already failed before it happened, and why the Women's March is failing, and like the Women's March failed. And it's like, at what, and something that got very little airtime is the fact that out of the Women's March, there were a number of people, women, who decided to run for political office and then unseated, in many cases, GOP incumbents. So, I mean, but there's not like, it's not always a clear cause and effect, and oftentimes it's like a sort of domino effect. But because the way we tend to think about the stories around protest as like, well, if it didn't go from X to Y within 2 weeks to 2 months, then it was pointless. What a waste of energy.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like we need to, number one, tell better narratives and stories about who we are, but also what the reality is of what's happening on the ground, right? Yeah. And I think it just, to me, that's the beginning of activism, or that's the beginning of organizing. It's not just a narrative. We have to tell the story that we are the majority. Yeah. Otherwise, it feels really helpless. Like, why would I even act,
totally.
Right? Yeah, and I think that's what's really powerful about reading your book is that, like, you really break down all the instances where we could be doing better, honestly. And, it also made me, I know you gave like a hopeful ending about what that means, but I think when I think about concrete takeaways from the book, I think about we need to support independent media. Absolutely. Right? There's ProPublica. Is that how you say it? Publica?
Yeah.
I don't know.
ProPublica, yeah.
Sorry. Sometimes I wonder if I'm over ethnicizing like words.
I mean, it sounds sexy if you're like
ProPublica.
Yeah. I mean, that's just like the Spanish language version.
Okay, I'm just tell a quick story. A friend of mine was coming home from North Carolina, and their friend was like, "Oh my God, I really like this fried chicken place. It was called Bojangles."
No, that's what I jokingly call it because I'm from North Carolina.
Oh. And they're like, no.
I either call
what
it
is
Bojangles or Bojongle.
Anyway, it's like, what? You mean Bojangles? Anyway, that was the friend over ethnic sizing.
That's amazing.
Anyway.
Right. And she's like, I want to make sure I'm getting this right. It's
Bojangles.
Bojangles.
So anyway, independent media, Publica. And then there's this idea around, like, what do we do in the face of mainstream media who just insists on covering the horse race and the judgment call around who wins or who loses, example, Women's March. Like, what can we do other than tweet our asses off ourselves,
Yeah, yes, support
So
independent
yes.
journalism for sure.
Yeah.
And then, I think people are starting to understand, there's starting to be a more visible gap in terms of like the narratives that are offered to us in terms of like following the people who are in power versus following what Americans are wanting. So obviously, all the polls in the lead up to the presidential election, it's like, whoops, right? But then this continues even today. So, in New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won, which was amazing. But again, we got this whole bevy of headlines that was just like, whoa, totally unexpected, total surprise. And it's not that surprising at all, because the fact is she was speaking very directly to what Americans are concerned about and what they want in a very unapologetic way.
Yeah.
And something that I like about that story as well about her win is that she went on the late night Colbert show and he was like, how do you explain it? Like the polls had you way down. Yeah. What's the deal? And she was like, oh yeah, I can explain that. So here's the deal. The way that we do polling is usually we're looking at expected voters.
Yeah.
Rather than, and so she was like, well, yeah, so we didn't focus on expected voters. We got voters out who don't normally come out.
Yep.
And again, in terms of like the conceit of my book, which is that we're the marginalized majority, we are the majority. If you look at the numbers, and if you're really into numbers, there are plenty in here, but if you're super wonk and want a lot of graphs and charts, read Steve Phillips's Brown is the New White. And he breaks down how, like, just by the numbers, if we got out the vote and reached voters who aren't coming out, especially among more typically historically marginalized populations, we win.
Easily win.
We just win.
Yeah, I mean, I was blown away by a couple of the numbers about how only about 30% of Americans were able to vote or something to that effect, like a third.
Yeah.
And then of that, whoever
Right.
voted, and then of that, whoever voted for Hillary versus Trump, right?
Yeah.
So that's already not the majority. And then, God, what was the thing that you were just saying just now?
About
Oh, well, I
Ocasio-Cortez?
forgot it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. JK, I forgot my thought.
Getting out the new voters, getting out the people who just aren't being
getting out
counted.
the new voters. Yeah, there's voter
There's that
suppression.
too,
So
yeah.
we just have to talk about the real life needs, and it actually kind of works. I mean, honestly, right? Like she really
Yeah.
just hit the ground.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
And I've been heartened to see, but again, like every time someone like
Ground
this
game was good.
runs,
Yeah.
it keeps being discussed as though it's an aberration. Like I gotta look up her name. I wrote it down because I keep forgetting it for some reason. Oh yeah, Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor of Georgia.
Yes.
Total badass, amazing, and she's just like a black woman who's a fantastic storyteller and speaks honestly and like about her experience, and everyone's like, oh, this is so crazy that she's connecting even with white voters, and it's again, and a conceit that I talk about in the book a lot is that there's such a boogeyman of like identity politics as the thing that's going to divide us, and especially among the left.
Yes.
Anytime there's a politically charged moment, there are like these people who crop up out of the woodwork. It's like they're just waiting for the moment to be like, identity, we must leave our identities behind.
What about class? What about class? Yes, and.
Yeah,
yes, and.
Yeah.
Can we do that? Can we hold two thoughts at the same time?
No, we already know that. It's hard. Yeah, it's bizarre. It's bizarre the way it's...
And this is as someone who used to work in the labor movement. And then I talk about my like Asian American identity and immigrant identity all the time. It's like, it's okay. We could do all of it.
Yeah.
Can we?
Yeah, and that dichotomy between race and class is so absurd, and also collapses the notion that like, well, first of all, it's always like the white working class. We have to talk to the white working class.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, but the working class is majority people of color, so let's just start there. But also the white working class is not this monolithic entity. Like, why are we lumping them all together in this way and separating them out from the working class people of color, which is the most age-old divide to like try to drive a wedge into in terms of like people being nefarious in power. You know, like
Yeah.
that's historically what's been done.
I feel like that's a lesson we're all learning right now in terms of talking about these multiple intersections, right? The concept of intersectionality. I wish there was like fewer syllables to capture that concept. That's more accessible, but that, you know,
Both and?
yeah, that we could be both and.
Yeah.
And that, you know, you don't say this thing is for women and people of color.
Yeah.
That in fact, guess what? There's people of color who are women, and there
Yeah.
are women who are people of color. And so there's these little things that we're kind of figuring out together, I think, in the age of social media around how to talk about this sort of intersections of our multiple identities. Don't you think? I feel like
Yeah.
those are the kind of conversations we're having, and it's hard, and it's doesn't feel comfy. Like, I mean, I get like this argument around like, okay, in this moving forward, if we are the majority, how do we organize ourselves, right? And I think we have to confront these types of rhetorical and argumentative divides that
Yeah.
like people use to separate us.
We're
Yeah.
so used to thinking of it as a conflict, that there's two
Yes,
sides
yes.
to the story. And so I think we often come to the table already being like, well, I'm here defending, you know, women's rights, but what about class? And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, no. And I think what's really instructive is that when we look at protests and protest movements in history, they hinge on identity. You know, like when we
yeah.
talk about some of the most incredible and impactful change in this country, it is movements that are founded on identity that drew a variety of allies together. It wasn't just a single identity.
Yeah.
And it's often queer women of color who, if you scrape beneath the surface of what we're seeing in textbooks, those are the people who are at the core of these movements, which I think, like, I kind of knew that, but when I was researching the book, it was like, oh, no, but really?
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously it's helpful to surface that history and learn that, but also just knowing that. It's like, oh, okay, so we should be, in terms of moving forward, we should be looking to these people who have been doing this work already and continue to be doing that work and join them, right? Be allies with them.
Yeah.
And if we're at protests or we're at, you know, groups that are interested in taking part in actions and we aren't seeing diverse voices in the room, we know there's something wrong.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, which isn't to say you should stop. It just means, like, who do we need to get into this room in order to really push forward for real substantive change?
Yeah, I think a great example of that is Black Lives Matter. You know, if you're familiar with sort of community and labor organizing down here in LA, the Bus Riders Union Strategy Center, they've been organizing here forever, right? Making sure that MTA doesn't raise, you know, the monthly pass all the time, you know, trying to make life more comfortable for working class folks. And, you know, when Black Lives Matter happened, and you know, some of you are on the internet, right? So you know that sometimes there's this sort of like condescending argument around hashtag politics, right? Like, oh, just because you have a hashtag doesn't mean you're doing something, right? And I remember when Black Lives Matter happened, and I saw who was behind it, I was like, oh, see? But because people were saying that about Black Lives Matter, but guess what? Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, was connected with on-the-ground people who have been organizing for decades.
Yeah.
Like Patrice, all the people that finally, yes, people got it right. You know, and it was the women's magazines, honestly, who got it right and trying to highlight who it was that really, right, led Black Lives Matter. They have these beautiful, you know, pictorials of, you know, Patrice and Alicia, and you're like, yes, these are the women who have been in the trenches organizing against police brutality, supporting working class folks, folks of color. And then all of a sudden, yes, now that we have the tool of social media, so hashtag Black Lives Matter. But, you know, I think we have such a deep education that we need to have of all the people who showed up at Women's March. Can you imagine, which, you know, touched a lot more people who don't typically march. Can you imagine if all of them got this level of sort of mass movement kind of change education, right? I mean, I feel like that's where we're at. We have to kind of do that, which makes me now feel like I have my marching orders as a stand-up comedian and a storyteller, which, by the way, I have a bone to pick.
Go on.
If you read into the book, which you will, you do, at fair amount of length, talk about the role of comedians.
I do. It's true.
Now, I did get a little quick background on you that you have spent 3 years doing improv on a house team in New York at People's Improv Theater, whatever.
I don't do it anymore.
Why are you trying to like not accept your history, your
No.
past?
It's not like I'm trying to hide my
don't
history.
hide.
It's just that I don't
tried
want people to be
stand up.
like, oh, she's a comedian.
You tried stand up.
Why is she so not funny?
Listen, you already told no. You've already talked about white men. You're no longer eligible to be on the New York Times editorial board.
It is
so.
rough in the trenches. It is rough.
So what's my point? So basically, you highlight the fact that there's different types of ways comedians can make fun of things.
Yes.
Right? That in fact there is a difference between true satire or parody and what you refer to as pastiche, which is a reference to another theorist, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, I don't know. I feel a little called out.
But
I feel a little defensive.
But see, Jenny, if you took a step back from being so quickly defensive, then you would give me an opportunity to say, I think you're doing the right kind of comedy.
What? Did you what? Wait, what? Say that again.
Jenny, you're doing the right kind of comedy.
Okay, that made me feel better. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really all that was for. I just wanted
And
to
we're done.
hear-
Thanks for coming out, guys.
I just wanted to feel reassured that I was not doing things that were toothless. But
yeah, it's an analysis that I think is really important.
Yes, it
comedy,
is.
because like the reality is that and the way that I look at it is exploring it through the lens of cynicism, right? So the earliest origin of the term cynicism is from ancient Greece, and it meant a radical truth-telling. It meant speaking the truth in the face of power, no matter the odds, essentially. Now, when we think of cynicism, the way we practice it, it's like this savvy knowingness. It's like this attitude, this refusal to be surprised or shocked when people behave, especially in power, incredibly poorly. And my concern there is that then reinforces this sort of now we're at a point of rapid degradation of the system, right? So that someone like Trump, who's a reality TV star, who behaves exactly according to our most cynical expectations of someone in power, it just kind of goes hand in hand with that. And the reason I focus on comedy is because there really has been over the past few years a rise in terms of how news is mediated, how we consume it. And in some part, this is because media has taken a bit of a nosedive. I think we're sort of finding our way back, actually, which we can. That's another conversation for another time.
Where are we finding ourselves back?
We'll come back to that. But in terms of the comedy, there's been a rise in like late night comedy shows, and what's been heartening to see is where when we had like Tina Fey doing Sarah Palin, right? It was amazing because she literally almost took verbatim quotes from Sarah Palin and then clipped on some bangs, and it was like, boom, satire. But then it started to get weirder and weirder when it was like, okay, now Sarah Palin's coming on the show.
Yeah.
Which, Tina Fey talked about later and was like, I did not want that to happen.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But I mean, that kind of thing ends up, it becomes a kind of like tacit support of this
co-signing,
and it's really messed up. Whereas I think there is comedy now, especially in this like more second generation of shows, like Trevor Noah, Samantha Bee, John Oliver. Like we're seeing, I think, a little bit more of a shift towards that truth telling, and also to that like not cynical laughing it off, but expressing outrage. And sometimes, and this is my favorite, when it's like encouraging people to do things, even if it's through a satirical, funny way of doing it. I mean, it was kind of brilliant when on the Colbert Report, when he had the guy come on and like he created a super PAC. Yeah. I don't know if you guys remember that. Yeah. And it was like, oh, you are, through your satirical show, you were exposing how gross it is to do, or how easy it is to do something so gross.
Yeah.
But I felt like that was fewer and far between that kind of contextualized comedy, and it's happening more and more now. But I feel like I would really love everyone to be like thinking about that when they're seeing comedy, because I think it really does do different things for us and inspire different kinds of energy.
Yeah, I think the words you might have used, I don't know if these are exact words, but is it numbing us, or is it actually instigating us or agitating us?
Yeah.
Don't you think? I feel like that's the difference. It's like, what is the art doing? Is it, here's the thing. Sometimes I like a good escapist movie at the old Cineplex.
Ye old Cineplex.
Ye old Cineplex. But I think it's like, yeah, as sort of this is what sucks is that we see ourselves as consumers, and in fact we need to be not that. Right? I feel like that's what it really is reminding me of, is that like we are, to be American is to see ourselves as consumers. That if what we consume and what we buy is who we are, whether it's art or media.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what does it mean for us to be actively responding to that?
Right, and asking those questions that are often thought of as like dewy-eyed and naive, like what do I think democracy should look like? What does it feel like? What is freedom actually? What, like we kind of discount these questions as being really like, well, I don't know. They're like that's for kids. But that's so problematic, because I think what's happened is we've started to shift. And I talk in the book about a story, is a conversation with my friend I think many people can relate to, which was, during the primaries before the presidential election, I was having the conversation of Hillary versus Bernie with a friend of mine, and she was like, I am super behind Bernie's policies, but I don't think he's going to win, so I'm going to support Hillary. And this was like the primaries. And she was already, and so I feel like cynicism starts to come into the room when we are sort of thinking of ourselves as the pollsters. We're like, who's the most electable? And that's a question that we should have. It's important to be somewhat practical and pragmatic, but I feel like we've moved so far in that direction, rather than saying, who do I support and why? Yeah. Who's going to fight for, rights for everyone, towards like, actual American promises that have yet to be delivered on in many ways.
So I just want to do a time check to see how much more time we have, because I do want to talk a little bit more about what we can do, because that always feels better when you talk about such big issues, Yeah. Q&A, right? Yeah, maybe we'll do Q&A. Yeah. But just a quick, a couple of things that through this book, what has it made you think about in terms of what we need to be doing? Like I'm not organizing with any group, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I answer the calls to like make phone calls or text, or you know what I mean? Like there's all that happened after the elections, but what do we do? Yeah,
I mean, I think we need to really move towards, and a lot of people are already doing this, moving towards recognizing that like this sort of level of civic engagement, it has to be something that we're doing every day, or like a part of our regular lives. Yeah. And I think the trick there, I'm not, I don't want to sound like, you just got to do the work, put your big girl pants on, but kind of do that. But also like, this should be fun, like it's not going to be fun all the time, but like, we're talking about, there are so many indivisible groups that have started up, and I know many friends of mine are part of them, and like they have formed into social groups, right? Yeah. They have formed into, and that's what it's going to take, right? We need to have our personal lives.
Organize a group,
or join a group.
This is how it feels, right? You're like, okay.
Yeah. But that's the thing, is protest and engagement needs to get a lot more fun. Yeah. And there's so many examples of that. There's a book, if you guys need some hope on the like concrete tactics and tools, called Beautiful Solutions by a friend of mine, Andrew Boyd, or he's one of the editors. But it just compiles all it, like, so that hopefully we can start thinking about this as and also recognizing that these are the stakes, right? This isn't just like, oh, I gotta go do my work. It's like, do you want healthcare? Yeah. Do you want to be able to retire? I do. I don't know how I'm going to, be able to do that legitimately. Like, and I feel like if we can start to bridge that gap of recognizing that the political realm is where we need to be seeking remedy, that all of these GoFundMes for people in our lives who have cancer, I mean, it's very lovely that there's this community, but it's so messed up that we are relying on each other in this way, because we need just basic, and in such a rich country, the fact that this is the reality is obscene. Yeah. Word. Let's give a round of applause for Denny,
amazing
too.
Onisha.